Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas or is having a fantastic Hanukkah. And by the time you hear this, I hope you have a great or had a great New Year's. It's been a while since today's guest has been on here, which is my fault. I've been a very long time fan. I was telling her before we got started that she will always, no offense to Catherine Mangu Ward or Nick Gillespie or Matt Welch or any of those guys, but she will always be the picture in the entry of editor of Reason magazine for me, because that's when I came to Washington. That's what she was known for, and she was a great editor. And last time she was on was for her really wonderful, and I say this if you hear a tone of surprise in my voice, it's not intentional, but it is there, because if there was a book that I didn't think I would want to read, it would be basically about the history of fabric and weaving and whatnot. But it really is a wonderful and really interesting book that changed my views on a whole bunch of things that I didn't know were changeable. And of course, the book was Fabric of Civilization. And the person I'm talking to today is none other than Virginia Postrel. Virginia, welcome back to the Remnant.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on, Jonah.
So, every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. And every time a politician craps from a great height on free market economies or on dynamism in our culture, I hear you kick a cat.
I would never kick a cat.
So in that spirit, this recent debate that's still sort of ongoing about H-1B visas and Hire American and all that kind of stuff just seemed like a perfect opportunity to have you back on and get your take on it. And so why don't we just sort of start there? What do you make of this whole brouhaha?
Well, I think I did a post-election post on my Substack, which has the very creative name of Virginia's newsletter, about the abundance factions, the potential for abundance factions within the two parties. And
why don't you explain abundance faction?
Yeah. So abundance faction is actually an idea I get from Steve Tellis, who's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins and something or another at the Niskanen Institute.
And frequent guest on this podcast.
Yeah.
So.
But the idea is that, well, first there's the idea of factions. That is, a political party is not just one thing. It doesn't all agree. And historically, the political parties have been much more sort of loosely organized bunches of people with quite different views than the way we think of it today. And the notion is, and Steve wrote about this in the context of the Democratic Party, but the notion is that there's a group of people who are concerned with abundance, with having more of everything, more economic prosperity, more opportunities, more education, whatever, anything good. It reminds me of Samuel Gompers, who was the American labor leader, who asked what did unions want? What did his unions want? He said more, which was very different from the sort of European quasi-Marxist approach. They weren't looking to overturn capitalism. They just wanted a bigger slice. But that's not really the abundance is not about redistribution. It's about growing the pie. And people who are Democrats tend to talk about abundance, and people who are more on the right tend to talk about progress. But there's this general, I call it the progress and abundance movement. There's this general movement that includes both of them. And I think there are also factions within both parties. And what I think we're seeing now within the sort of Trump coalition is a split between the people who voted for Trump and in many cases were quite prominent in supporting Trump, who want to make America great in the sense of we want America to do great things. We want progress. We want, catching rockets with chopsticks. We want skyscrapers. We want to build. It's time to build, as Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, said. We want all that stuff. And that's, most prominently represented by Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy to some degree, and a lot of people that you've never heard of and never will hear of because they're just, guys who have a small business someplace, but that's what they identify with Trump. They think of Trump as like the great entrepreneur. You and I may have a different opinion, but I respect those people. I don't respect Trump, but I respect some of his voters. Then you have the people who are less, I would say, make America great as America first. And they're about dividing a small, possibly even shrinking pie. But it's much more about who's in and who's out, who are our people and who are their people. And this has all come to a head in the context of immigration. And part of it is, as you have said, is that these, Silicon Valley is full of brilliant people who are idiots about things that they don't know about, because their problem is they think because they're smart, they know everything. And I mean, Washington is also full of people who are the exact flip side of that. And, and in The Future and Its Enemies, the book that kind of brought us to discussing this back, I wrote it back it came out in 1998. I call a lot of these people technocrats, which are smart guys who want to tell you how to, do everything. They want the future, but they want it to look exactly like their 15-point plan. And what you have in the two parties is this kind of alliance that these abundance factions or progress factions are made up of people who are what I call in the book dynamists, who are very much about bottom-up trial and error progress, market processes, scientific discovery, all of those kinds of things. And people who are technocrats who like abundance, like progress, but they want it to look like exactly their picture. And so you have these kind of coalitions. So what happened with immigration is that people in Silicon Valley like H-1B visas, which are a very specific kind of visa that you can bring in people to work for a specific company for a specific amount of time, and they're very important for bringing in technical talent. They're also abused in various ways, but that doesn't exclude the fact that they're valuable to some people. And Trump has since said, oh yeah, I love H-1B visas. We've brought in a lot of people on H-1B visas. And there were people who saw that this, who basically don't like those damn foreigners, and don't want, they think they voted for Trump not just to prevent chaos at the border or crack down on illegal immigrants, but to significantly reduce the number of immigrants in American life. And, it's like National Review circa 1996, which this is mean of me to bring this up to you, but in the 90s, National Review was a hotbed of anti-immigrant sentiment, very, and pretty explicitly, they didn't like the non-Anglo-Saxons, let's put it that way. And I, as the descendant of, people who were here before the revolution, found it incredibly offensive that these two Brits were telling us how to build our country. But anyway, that's down a rat hole. But so this burst into controversy on Twitter, and Vivek Ramaswamy, as being the most like guy you want to push his face in when you see him, did his guy who wanted to put his face in riff where he said, well, the problem is all these American kids who watch TV and play sports when the Asian kids are doing more extra special homework. And, so as Tyler Cowen wrote in putting some good advice to the Doge people, it immediately became a status game, and that was not good. So insulting, insulting the I don't know, to put it in an ethnic term, the Scots-Irish is never a good way to go, because we are an ornery bunch of people, and we do not like being told that you are better than us, even if, in fact, you are better than us.
So, a few clarifying points. One, like, I admit I have not spent a lot of time of late. I mean, the last time I remember following these kinds of arguments was our mutual friend Ron Bailey, was
Right.
Waxing prolix on the idea of cornucopianism, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
which it
yeah.
seems to me
and
is sort
Ron actually wrote a good article feature for a reason, sort of explaining this progress and abundance movement. And
Yeah.
I mean, and there's like all these different little think tanks, and they all have names that sound exactly the same. Anyway, so going back.
So my point, but my point is like, so it may just be that I'm not up to speed on the jargon of the moment, but in my experience, I don't recall reading a lot of conservatives, people on the right, talking about using the word progress. I mean, prosperity seems like the more normal.
No, they do. They do.
I mean, I believe you.
It's a very California thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's not so much the people in Washington. I mean, there's some, but there are a lot of people who, I mean, maybe they're more libertarian, but they definitely, I mean, what they want to do is bring back, an idea of progress. I mean, Works in Progress magazine, which is nowadays owned by Stripe, but it's London based, and it was.
Well, you're a contributing editor.
I'm a contributing editor, right? I forgot we had that discussion before. So Works in Progress magazine, it was started by people who were at least some of them were working with sort of right-leaning think tanks who wanted a way to write longer pieces that weren't just policy papers and that sort of thing. And then eventually became its own thing, and it's owned by Stripe, and it has a staff and stuff. But the idea is to, I mean, I call it dynamism, just to get to a place where we improve people's lives by letting people do stuff.
Right.
And the most successful angle of this, and here you really do see people from right and left on both sides of the issue, is in the YIMBY debates over housing. So you've got people who are basically free market types, and you have people who are San Francisco progressives who are saying, look, the only way we're going to get out of this problem of young people can't afford to live any place, and people can't afford to people can't afford to move to the most productive parts of the economy because the housing is too expensive. We need to allow people to build more housing. And depending on how market oriented you are or how left wing you are, you may, also want a lot of subsidized housing. But essentially, even the people who are more on the left in that movement have come to the realization that you need to expand supply at every level, and that includes letting builders build expensive housing.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent I've been following a lot of this stuff lately, it's been with a certain amount of schadenfreude, watching Ezra Klein have the epiphany that regulations could be a problem, which I think is, I mean, good for him for, admitting it, but it's kind of wild to see these, sort of very progressive types who used to be just ardent defenders of basically the regulatory state.
Yeah.
Matt Iglesias has been doing some of this too. Where they're now like, oh, it turns out that those crazy right wingers and those libertarians had a point.
Yeah. Well, I would distinguish between Ezra and Matt. I mean, I know Matt better than I know Ezra. I even know Ezra. I met him once. We had a panel at the Breakthrough Institute Breakthrough Institute conference a few years ago, and where he had read The Future and Its Enemies, and he told me I'm a technocrat. Which is, given how bad I make the technocrats sound, I thought that was good. But Matt, I think, is more skeptical of regulation in general. I don't mean as an idea, but he's more interested in looking at things like regulation on private builders, whereas Ezra is skeptical of regulations that limit what the government can do.
Right.
I mean, I was just reading his year-end interview, and he talked about how he has come to realize that people like him were wrong to defend regulation always, because people like me were so obviously doesn't mention me, but and you were so down on regulation, and he realizes that no, sometimes regulations get encrusted and they become procedural blockages to things that good progressives want to do. And now he has some more informed, I would say, view of regulation. I mean, he could have read Jonathan Rauch's book Demosclerosis back in the 90s, but he wasn't born then.
Or Mansur Olson even before that.
Right. But well, Jonathan is basically popularizing Mansur Olson, as he would tell you. He'd be the first to tell you.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to disparage Jonathan. But so here's the thing where I'm going to push back a little bit. I understand, and I agree with you that Elon Musk represents, as sort of an avatar, that kind of crowd. I am in awe of the things he's done in the private sector, and I'm very impressed by all of it. I am less convinced that those guys, the Silicon Valley bros, are the dynamists, than some people are, because to me, it's entirely possible that they're more like the railroad barons of the 19th century, who talked a great game about how awesome capitalism was, but at the same time said, we need the state to make it really easy for us to do our stuff and make it really hard for our competitors to do what they want to do.
Right.
And, the way in which, like, I find it kind of hilarious. I don't know where you come down on crypto. I'm sure you're more informed.
I come down on crypto as saying, back in the day when I was writing columns for Bloomberg, I thought, well, maybe I should buy Bitcoin just to experience it and write about it. And I put a thing on my Facebook page, and this guy I know said, oh yeah, I'll sell you a Bitcoin for $400. And then I decided, I'll lose the password and all that. And I never followed up on it. And of course, I'd be like fabulously wealthy if I'd bought a Bitcoin for $400. But anyway,
but the crypto crowd is great at talking. And I see a lot of the old Goldberg crowd move into the crypto crowd, right?
Yeah.
But they're great at talking about, this is the next big thing, and capitalism and unfettered, getting away from fiat currency and free markets and yada, yada, yada. And at the same time, they're like, and of course, the federal government should have 5% of its holdings in crypto.
Yeah.
And that is, like basically just a transfer payment. And it's very much like the Goldfinger strategy, right? Just take a bunch of a scarce thing off the market to make the stuff that they own more valuable. And so I don't trust, I no longer trust a lot of particularly if Vivek Ramaswamy is involved in any of it.
Yeah.
The top line rhetoric is I see as much more sizzle than steak. And like Elon Musk has vested interests that are good for him, and his subsidies for electric cars, his supply chain with China and all that kind of stuff. And so when he spins it as free market this and free market that, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying I don't necessarily trust it.
Yeah. I mean, you got to take everybody with a grain of salt. I mean, I'm not the one calling these people dynamists. I mean, there are dynamists in Silicon Valley. I'm not the one calling them that. David Brooks is the one calling them that. But I actually recently went and dug up the article that I wrote for the Washington Post Outlook section back in 1990, which was the kind of first origin of the stasis versus dynamism division that I developed in The Future and Its Enemies. And sorry, readers, listeners, we aren't explaining it very well. But I hadn't read it in, very, very long time. It's actually until I put it on my website, it's really hard to find because the Washington Post archives doesn't have it and newspapers.com doesn't have it, but it was reprinted in some other newspaper. So I got it from there. I mean, I have a physical copy, but I wanted something electronic. Anyway, what that really was about was not the sort of carefully limbed divisions that I developed in the book, but it was really about abundance factions. It was about, how people who like the idea of growth in both parties are distinct from people who think growth is bad in both parties, and that you were getting, unusual alliances like Jesse Jackson and Michael Milken being together and stuff. And so it was less about sort of a detailed understanding of how progress works, which is what I developed in The Future and Its Enemies, than about this political moment, which kind of, I think I was totally right, except that 9/11 kind of screwed everything up and made foreign policy be the big issue for a long time. And now I'm back. but anyway, so I think that's kind of what's going on. As far as people in Silicon Valley, they're human beings. They have self-interest. They tend to tell themselves that whatever is good for them is good for America, and is good for progress. They're not always wrong. And I'm agnostic about that. I mean, now that he's way ahead, Musk is less interested in subsidies for electric cars than he used to be, for example. But I think he probably, I should say I reviewed the Walter Isaacson biography of him for the Beacon. And if people want to see that, they can find it on my website. But I think he is somebody who understands sort of where progress and abundance come from in a way that says it comes from, in a non-Ezra Klein way, in a way that says it comes from people doing things. That does not mean he's some sort of principled opponent of government action that's good for him. So anyway, that's
I guess what I'm getting at is, since we're bringing up receipts from the old days, in the 1990s or early 2000s, your former Reason colleagues, Nick Gillespie and Matt Welch, had that book about the rise of the independents.
Yeah, no offense to them. That was a ridiculous claim.
And
love those guys, but.
And I debated them about it a bunch, and like David Bose, may his memory be a blessing. There was this rhetorical trick that a lot of libertarians used back in those days, and it goes something like this: let's look at all of these issues that Americans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents, are libertarian on. Right. Therefore, libertarians control the political center.
No, it's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous, and I have never, ever, ever believed that or said that or claimed that and as I say, I love Nick and Matt, but it was crazy. And the whole
okay, so I'm glad you agree, but yes. Here's the point I'm trying to get at, which is that I think everybody is a dynamist about the things they want to be a dynamist about.
Yeah. Right.
And they're stasists.
Yes, right.
Terrible word, by the way.
I know. I can't help it, but it's, dynamism versus stasis. And it's,
I get it,
right.
But
I mean, the my European and British friends, talk about the, what do they call it? The no growth people, but it's got a different name. Degrowth. Degrowthers, that's a great example of that. But.
And so so what ends up happening is you get people who are, it's sort of like the free speech stuff. I was just talking to Greg Lukianov about this. It's like the actual number of truly free speech people in this country is very, very small. But in any political contest, half the country is going to be on the side of the truly free speech people. And It's
right?
sort of like that with
So
the
here,
prosperity people, right?
yeah. So here's my political analysis using my. So I should probably, there's a video people can watch that of an introduction to dynamism. It's on my Substack. It's also on the Roots of Progress
We'll put a link in the show notes.
YouTube channel, and my YouTube channel. I have a list of a playlist that includes it. But anyway, so the idea is you have a division between dynamism and stasis, and it's not just political but cultural and how people think. And on one side, you have people who like the idea of an open-ended future. They like the they support bottom-up discovery and experimentation with feedback, learning, sort of learning by incremental experimentation feedback. And on the other side, you have people who want either stability, and this is where I refine the concepts, stability, and I call them reactionaries in the book, which is they want a specific sort of utopian or whatever, a truly unchanging society. And somebody like the Catholic integralists would be an example of that today, the true intellectual version. But there's a lot of that in the MAGA coalition, but they can't agree on what the ideal society is. You get extreme greens who think it's being hunter-gatherers. You got a lot of people who think it's the medieval village. You got a lot of people who think it's the 1950s America. Their weakness is they can't agree, but they have that impulse that what they want is a society that stays still. And then you have the technocrats that we've discussed a bit, who are the people who say their central value is control. And they say, yeah, I love the future. I love progress. It should look exactly like this. And that was, as you have written at book length, and that was it was in the early 20th century. That was really an ideology. I mean,
Right.
It was this planning ideology that said, look at these great things that have been accomplished by by planning steel production and steel mills and railroads. And we just take that and apply it to all society and eliminate wasteful profits and wasteful, failed experiments. And everybody can be, prosperous. So now it's more like an impulse where it's like regulation is good.
Right.
if there's a new thing, oh dear, it's unregulated, we got to control it. It's less of an ideology and more. So and dynamists, the people I like, the people I would identify with, their central value is actually learning. So it's a different kind of liberalism from the classic sort of libertarian liberalism. The center. And this site is not in the book. This is stuff I've come to from working at Chapman University and the Smith Institute with John Thrasher, who's a philosopher who's interested in dynamism. And I was like, how do I explain this to philosophers? And I say, dynamism is a form of liberalism that centers learning as opposed to justice or liberty or other good things that other forms of liberalism center. And I say, it doesn't mean it's against liberty or against justice. It's just like, what do they care about? Which is, of course, a very non-philosopher way of thinking about anything, because, philosophers tend to want one thing to be the center of everything. Anyway, so that's the kind of basic idea. Politically, dynamists are always in the minority. I mean, that's my view. And in sort of Western democracies, technocrats tend to have, if not a majority, well, probably a majority, but of people who have some conscious thought about politics, but definitely a large plurality. And they get to decide which way the world goes, essentially,
right.
Whoever they ally with. And what's interesting about these abundance and progress factions is you have within the two parties, an alliance between technocrats and dynamists at the same time that you have an alliance between technocrats, other factions that are alliances between technocrats and reactionaries. And it's who, kind of have an ideal state of the world. So that's my take on politically what's going on. And the way the technocracy thing comes out in the immigration debate, not just, I mean, obviously there's a lot of self-interest involved, as there always is, but it comes out by in the saying that, yeah, it's good if we have immigrants who are in the top 1% of tech talent. That's good. It's bad if we have immigrants who are poorly educated but can come and take care of old people. You know, I'm not ready to say we should have open borders, which is sort of the classic libertarian point of view, but I do think we need a much less technocratic immigration system. And what we have is one of sort of Ezra Klein's incrustation nightmares, which is the immigration system is crazy. You know, it's impossible to come here legally from Latin America if you aren't like super highly educated. And so the result is a lot of illegal immigration and misuse of the asylum process and all that stuff. It's crazy difficult to take one of those to get one of those H-1B visas, which is for tech talent. And then once you get here, you have to stay at the same company, and there's all these kinds of problems with it. And every kind of visa category has these sorts of problems. I mean, my favorite probably is just the lottery, which is very unpopular with everyone, but I think it's great. And I have a friend who came here from Uganda that way, and she's fabulous.
So I'm utterly sympathetic with the 30,000 foot view of dynamism over stasis and all that. I'm just so you know where I'm coming from. I'm increasingly of the mind that there are remarkably few new ideas. Right. And that many of these things, when you say this is a different kind of liberalism than classical liberalism and all that,
it's an evolution of it, and it's very Hayekian, for example.
I can hear the Hayekianism.
I mean, I'm not pretending that like Virginia Postrel, got the revelation. I mean, this is all very incremental. It's just that's why I talk about it as a form of emphasis. Yeah. It's not, it's like, I mean, if you're in the 17th century, what you're really worried about is like how to get people to stop killing each other over religion.
Right.
And while there's certainly parts of the world where that's a live issue, the United States of America is not one of them, despite what some really afraid people on the, from the left of center and some really fanatical people from the right, on the right might think. It's not really one of them. So, what are you concerned about? And I'm concerned about learning and discovery. And while it may be true that there are not a lot of new philosophical ideas, there are new ideas and new creations and new, whether you're talking about forms of art or forms of technology. And there are also ideas and creations and that can't ever get realized because there's blockage to them.
Yeah. So I got no first order disagreement with any of that. My point is that in the tradition of Hayek and even Burke, right, is this idea of trial and error, right?
Right.
And it seems to me that, like, I'm glad these conversations are happening in California and not in Washington, because then when they happen in Washington, you end up with things like, the new program for dynamism, right?
Yes,
it's like
right.
The technocrats
exactly.
take over the buzzword, right? So I think that's a good thing to keep it out of Washington. But at the same time, I'm not sure that there's anything in classical liberalism, which includes things like pluralism, right? And federalism and subsidiarity, that doesn't include this stuff. Because one of the things that's sort of essential to the learning is allowing different communities to live different ways. Right. And what works for some communities will not work for other communities. What works, I always tell people that my standard line is that the pursuit of happiness is an individual right, but happiness is almost impossible to achieve without other people.
Right.
We find the institutions that work for us, and that means there needs to be a kind of since we were casting shade on him, I'll credit Nick Gillespie for this. He's talking about, he likes the phrase utopia of utopias. I don't like the word utopia in any context.
But you kind of got that from Robert Nisbet.
I know.
But Robert Nozick, rather.
I'm trying to help him out. Yeah, probably not Nisbet. But
right, very different.
But my point is that you got to let different people live different ways, and it turns out, I mean, the Laboratories of Democracy stuff was kind of a misnomer from Brandeis, but the idea in it is that's how you actually do learning, is societal learning, is like having people kick the tires on a whole bunch of different things, and so I'm just increasingly of the mood to defend classical liberalism, and think it doesn't need to be reinvented. It actually just kind of needs to be applied, and the problem I think that you run into with the sort of standard libertarian, at least the standard libertarian of yore, is that you have to ask them to tolerate compartmentalized stasis in certain parts of life, because if, like, here's my big, and listeners of this are familiar with this point, but like my biggest problem with the post-liberal integralist Catholic crowd is they never say, let's give this a shot in Rhode Island, right? Let's do this,
the worst possible place historically,
or wherever, but some small contained place where you can actually have a real living experiment with a different form of social organization. They want to start by imposing it on 335 million people. And I think libertarians have a similar problem, is that they want to do libertarianism from above rather than let it come up from below, and that means letting some places be super libertarian and letting other places not be, and let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Well, people who think deeply about this, and I'm kind of only on a medium level of deepness, think about the issues. I mean, the real critical issue is how hard is it to exit? And that's not just whether there's permission, but actually what are the transaction costs? And this came up in my second book, The Substance of Style, in the context of regulation of the built environment. And what's interesting is if you look at the market for housing, and get away from the issues of abundance and whether, but if you look at the market for housing, in many, many places, people will pay more to live in a community that has a lot of rules about, what color you can paint your house, and do you have to keep your garage door closed, and all this stuff. But that does not mean, in my mind, that either that you should outlaw HOAs, which there's a lot of people, I don't think so much conscious libertarians, but sort of natural liberty, this offends me kind of people who think that. And nor does it mean that every place should have those sorts of rules. But if the entire state of California has rules like that, then you have a problem.
Right.
And so the question is, what if you're going to have subsidiarity, which is, this word that people throw around, or even federalism, how small are the units and how hard is it to do something different? And so, pretty much you're going to experience that by trial and error too. But for example, in California, the way we're getting more housing built in cities is by state legislation that says you have to build housing. I mean, it's complicated exactly how it does that, but basically it says, you have to come up with a housing plan that, based on your projected population, current and projected population, you will have an adequate supply of housing at different price levels. And if you don't have to, but if you don't, we get rid of all your zoning. And the thing about zoning, which I learned from Nolan Gray, I didn't know this, he has a good book about zoning called Arbitrary Lines, is that zoning everywhere is actually a state rather than a local function, that like the enabling legislation is state level and the local municipalities. So that is a big hammer. It is a big hammer at the state level. It's not the best way to deal with that problem, but given the way all the different regulations in California have interacted and the way people who currently have housing get a vote and people who want housing in the future don't, outside the market,
right?
Something that allows something more resembling market processes to take place is something I support.
Yeah.
Not that I think it's the perfect world. So I think that, you talk about my 30,000 level, 30,000 foot. I was like, is it yard? Is it meter? What the hell is it? 30,000 foot view. But I think invoking subsidiarity or federalism without thinking about how it works in the real life is also an issue.
I think that's totally fair.
I mean, in the classic case, of course, and this is why, people on the left hate federalism, is the South imposing Jim Crow laws and segregating its public facilities against what the market was telling people. And finally, you have federal hammer coming down and saying, no, you can't do this. I disagree with the libertarians who opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I support it.
Yeah, no, look, I was going to bring up that example because it is a, just to disclose my, to lay my Burkeanism on the table. One of the points of Burkeanism is that you can take any principle too far.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was necessary to crush the authoritarian, for one of the statist regimes of the South,
and not just status, but also enforced with terrorism.
Yeah, it was necessary to do, but that doesn't mean because that was necessary, therefore the federal government should get involved in housing.
I totally agree. I mean, it doesn't mean it's like that was a specific case, and there was a specific history and problems with it. And that's another thing that I think is part of dynamism, and it's also part of at least certain concepts of liberalism, is that there's this great line from the philosopher Stephen Toulmin: there is no scratch, and I would continue that to say you never get to start from scratch, and if someone says you should start from scratch, run, because that way lies tyranny. And the other thing is that one thing people really value is a certain kind of continuity with the past. And I've written about this in nearly every book I've written. And the most recent book, The Fabric of Civilization, I write about it, about Guatemala, the dress of Guatemalan indigenous people, which has evolved. And in fact, now many of the everyday things are made in factories, and probably some of them even come from China. But it still looks distinctly Maya because people value that. And another example I would use, and I almost put this in, I wrote my latest Substack post is about religion, and it's America's religious exceptionalism. And I thought about using some photos of the chuppah I made when I got married, and then the repurposing of it by changing the names that were embroidered on it from Shlomo and Drora, which sounds like a political party because it means peace and freedom, to Mina and Penina, which rhyme. When my sisters-in-law got married, when same-sex weddings were recognized in California. I mean, by that time they already, had a house and two kids and, been living like married people for a long time. But anyway, well, why do you have gay synagogues? And some people would think this is terrible and an abomination, but it's also because people want a connection with their people and with their faith and with the traditions that they come from. And yet they want it adapted in other ways. And so in part, this recent article, which doesn't talk about any of this, about my sister's-in-law's wedding, is a defense of sort of cafeteria religion in America as an inevitable consequence of our lack of an established church. Even though I actually am personally, from a background that says like these things actually matter, like whether you think that Jesus was God incarnate, and no matter David Brooks, to mention him again, doesn't want to make up his mind. But anyway, it's a rambling essay, but people seem to like it.
All right, so we can continue to nerd out on the high concept stuff, but I want to go back to sort of the politics of this a little bit.
Right.
At the beginning, you described the two groups as sort of the abundance people, and in the Trump world, it's for the America Firsters. It's this sort of static. We don't want any brown people and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I think it's important to say, as someone who came to National Review 2 years after the period that you were discussing, but has been privy to many, many, many of these arguments over the years, and was always a bit of a squish on the immigration stuff. It is important to say that it is absolutely true that the vast preponderance of the racists, particularly on Twitter, are on one side of this argument, but that doesn't mean everybody on that side of the argument is racist.
Absolutely not. No.
And but I think I was going to say, I think the America. I mean, we don't want to get too bogged down in just sort of nomenclature.
I mean, I use that as a shorthand because I think their idea of make America great again. I mean, I think that phrase reflects the idea that Trump thinks America's great, pinnacle was in the 1950s.
Right.
And he wants to, and so that's his promise. And so, although he loves Elon Musk, chopsticks catching rockets or whatever, but I think a lot of people hear that, and that's what they want too. They want, big companies, big unions.
Right. No, I agree.
And, I'm from South Carolina, and the 1950s in the South were better than the 1940s or the 1930s, but not the pinnacle of prosperity or cultural influence, even though, ironically, a lot of the people who vote for Trump are from that region.
Right. But my point was that it was going to be that you can make no, it's okay. I mean, forgetting the historical connotations of America First and all that, right? Which I don't think Trump knew about when he embraced it. It seems to me like you could make a dynamism case. I mean, that's what Ramaswamy and Musk are trying to do, is make an America First case for bringing in the H-1B people, because that way we can rah-rah beat China, right?
Right.
I think the key word in Make America Great Again is the again, right?
Yeah.
It is this nostalgia thing.
The nostalgia,
which,
I agree.
Since we cast shade on Robert Nisbet has this great line about nostalgia where he says nostalgia is the rust of memory. And my problem with the nostalgia stuff is that it's the right-wing version of utopianism, right?
It is.
The left finds its utopias in the future,
right?
And the right finds its utopias in the past.
Right.
And the problem is broad brushstrokes, lots of caveats, lots of, but what about this stipulated? The past kind of sucks. And the further back you get in the past, the more it sucks.
You clearly belong to the progress and abundance faction.
But you find this Pew polling, there's all this polling out there that basically every 10 years, people say things were better 50 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And that's nuts.
Yeah, they're nostalgic. They're nostalgic for the 70s. It's like, really? I was here in the 70s and they were horrible.
Yeah, I mean,
unless you were like in the particular age group where they meant like having lots of sex,
right?
Something.
Well,
but everybody else, they were horrible.
But the lots of sex stuff, right? This is where it gets to the problem. I bring this up on here all the time. Is like you have all of these very online testicle tanning bros on Twitter who talk about how things were better in the Roman Empire because they'd be a general. But the reality is,
peasant.
They'd be a peasant.
Everybody who thinks they're reincarnated, they were never like a peasant.
And so everyone who thinks it was better in the 70s, they think they're the rock star who was getting laid a lot. They don't think they were the guy who was killed by a Weather Underground bombing or being hosed by Bull Connor.
Well, it's not just that. There's this incredible nostalgia for assembly line work. Mm-hmm. This is one of my pet peeves. So this makes me think two things. One is that, in the part of the country where I come from, the good jobs, the jobs that were so good, Black people weren't allowed to have them, were working in textile mills and, which were loud and dangerous, and you got brown lung, and the pay was pretty lousy by today's standards too. So, not everybody in the country was partaking in this mythical 1950s time where, you could raise a family on one working class job and, in your tiny little house and with no stuff. So there's that. Not everybody was in that, but the other thing is that, first of all, the 50s led to the 60s. Like, there was a dissatisfaction with that. And that's one reason that optimism, I have this long essay in Works in Progress in the current issue about the glamour of progress and glamour of the future, why it broke down, and, how you might reclaim it, or maybe you don't want to, because I read this book, Power of Glamour, which is about glamour as a form of visual rhetoric. But anyway, so it broke down. And I always think about, I had this 9th grade social studies teacher who was from Michigan, and he had come to Greenville, South Carolina, because he went to Bob Jones University, and as did many teachers in the Greenville public schools. And he used to tell us stories about how he would work these summer jobs in the auto factory, and the jobs were so boring that the guys would wreck things just to have some entertainment, so they would, this was U.S. auto industry before foreign competition made it get its act together. So anyway, that's neither here nor there, but yeah, there is, and this is the stasis thing. And when I originally was going to write The Future and Its Enemies, I thought of there being radicals and reactionaries, and then I just threw them all together as people who want things to be unchanging. But the left-wing version is the future utopia where everything stays the same under the the wise hand of the central planner or whatever, and we make new Soviet man. And the more right-wing version is it's almost some place in the past that is idealized in unrealistic ways.
It's funny. I always like to point out to people that when Marx describes the ideal society at the end of history, it's basically Rousseau's Noble Savage, right? It's just a dude who just lives in accord with nature, and the state withers away because everyone's empowered to be a poet in the morning and a hunter in the afternoon and all this nonsense. And
some of the abundance people
talk that way too.
They want that. That's what they want. They may have good ideas of process, but that's sort of what they want. They want so much abundance that you only work if you want.
Right.
And you work at what you want. And that is a conceivable achievement in the sense, in pure material prosperity sense of what we could get there. And this is, I really like Neil Stephenson's book, The Diamond Age, which basically envisions a world in which that's happened. That world is not without its problems.
Exactly.
There are just certain problems you'd rather have than others. In the context of the talks I give on the fabric of civilization, I get a lot of questions about, the tremendous amount of textiles and apparel specifically that we have, and the environmental impact of that. And I say, this is a problem of abundance. We do. I mean, there are real problems. It's a problem of abundance. I would rather have the problems of abundance than the problems of scarcity, partly because abundance helps you address the problems of abundance. And you see that argument made a lot within the context of climate change.
Yeah, but don't you get into, I mean, it seems to me part of the problem is, my last book, Suicide of the West, I make this case, passionate case, sincere case for liberal democratic capitalism, and the fundamental problem that it faces is, first of all, human nature, because
human nature always a problem. I mean, but it's nothing special about liberal democratic capitalism having that problem. That's just a problem.
Well, yeah, no, but I think there is something special, because I think liberal democratic capitalism, unlike, say, monarchy, is unnatural. Like, it is this, it's the Hayek thing about the macrocosm and the microcosm, that the rules of the extended order do not come to us naturally. We have to actually be civilized into understanding them. And like the whole, I mean, like you talked before about how, liberalism in the 17th century was trying to figure out a way to keep people from killing each other over religion. Killing people over religion is natural. What's unnatural is saying, no, living with people who disagree with you is...
We don't want to deal with that.
And so the sort of the meta problem is ingratitude. Is not... like, we teach people in this culture to be entitled and to have grievance. And, what is identity politics in a lot of ways, other than this idea that simply by accident of your birth, you have a grievance against society that needs to be fixed at the highest level through processes of social justice and whatnot, rather than just sort of like being grateful that you were born in this incredible moment and making the best, as pursuing happiness as you see it. And so I just don't see how... I think the abundance crowd, which again, as I'm probably on 9 out of 10 policies, I'm with you guys, but they're never going to hit this steady state place where people are happy with the system.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, I can't speak for everyone in the abundance crowd. I don't think that, but I think it's intrinsically a non-steady state idea. And certainly the idea of dynamism is a non-steady state idea. And I've actually written about this, I think, on Substack, but I mean, it's in the book, but it's less foregrounded than it would be if I put it today, is that dynamism is driven by discontent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, because it's all about form follows failure, which is a phrase I get from a guy named Henry Petrosky, who wrote about made things. So he's writing about artifacts, but I think it's generally true that when you have something, you have this coffee cup and you see, what you don't like about it, and you make a different, better coffee cup, or you try to. I mean, that's the process that drives dynamism. Well, the fundamental assumption there is that you're never satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
You might be grateful, and I'm big on gratitude, and part of when I write about history and I write about progress and all these things, partly that's so that people realize how great their lives are.
Yeah, you cannot read Fabric of Civilization and say, man, I wished I could have worked, making fabric for the last 1,000 years.
I mean, I actually do weave, but I don't spin, which was the way women.
Right, but you do it.
Lives.
You do it as
I do it as a hobby.
Yeah, as a pastime.
I'm very grateful that I can just buy. First of all, that I can afford, and secondly, that I can just buy really nice yarn to weave with.
Right.
That's. But so I'm all for gratitude, but I think that part of the dynamist vision is realizing that you're never going to be satisfied. And this is a critique you get a lot from, leftist critics of consumerism, is that, you don't need those different choices or whatever. You should just be satisfied. And as a psychological advice, that's not terrible. But as social policy, it's not a good idea, because allowing people, especially through bottom-up processes, to address sources of dissatisfaction is a good thing, even if it leads to new and formerly unknown sources of dissatisfaction. And I have to, tell myself this partly because I don't always like the things that people want to do and experiment with. But I think that is how you learn. And partly you learn, what isn't a good idea.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I always think about Bernie Sanders complaining about all the different kinds of deodorant you can buy, which is such a perfect encapsulation of that mindset, right?
Right, exactly.
And so I have this long-standing gripe against John Rawls.
Okay.
And for listeners who don't know, John Rawls, very important philosopher, a lot of interesting things to say. He's the guy who came up with this idea of the veil of ignorance, which is really a kind of a play on James Harrington's idea of if you have two people cutting a pie, the other person, one person cuts the pie, but then the other person who doesn't cut the pie gets to pick which slice they want.
Right.
And but anyway, the veil of ignorance, I think, is an incredibly useful and interesting thought experiment.
Right.
My problem with it, well, I have two problems with it. One is where he comes down on abortion. Because if you actually believe that you have these disembodied souls that prior to existence, and all you want to do is figure out what best chances they have, it's not reconcilable with abortion. But we don't need to talk about abortion.
It's not reconcilable with anything that would limit the number of people born.
Right. It's just metaphysically it's problematic, and his explanation of it is bad. But the thing I want to get at is it is the ultimate philosophical defense of technocracy. Because what he is basically saying is put yourself in the mind, you are God.
Right.
And you get to decide, talk about there is no scratch, right? He's basically saying you get to decide how every institution and polity at every level is designed based on a very narrow conception of social justice.
Right.
And I think that mindset can be found in a great number of people who are flying the dynamist flag, right? The Silicon Valley tech bros. I think a lot of these guys have decided that this country is going to be an oligarchy. Like Peter Thiel doesn't want it to be, but it looks like it's going to be. So better to be an oligarch than not.
Right. Okay. One, I'm not sure those guys are flying the dynamist flag. I mean, part of what I want to do with these various things I write and with talks at places like the Roots of Progress is to inject some dynamist sophistication, if I can be flattering, into the sort of tech enthusiasm for progress as, spaceships. And my article, in Works in Progress about progress and glamour makes a big deal of the point that there were different, the fact that the idea of future and the progress was glamorous up until the late 60s and that was widely shared was not primarily because of the enthusiasm of nerds like me reading You Will Go to the Moon every day in kindergarten, but was because of other groups. There was a technocratic group, which is a problem, and there was also just regular people who wanted refrigerators. Anyway, but so I think that that's right. On John Rawls, the person you should talk to is my former colleague at Chapman, John Thrasher, because he and a few other people have this kind of, he's a philosopher, academic philosopher with books piled up everywhere in his office. He's read everything. But his agenda is to say, no, Rawls is wrong, and other, highly acclaimed views in philosophy are wrong because they assume stasis, and that they start from the idea that you want to get to a static utopia. I'm mangling his work terribly.
Sounds right.
But he's very good when he presents this, and that is, that's a problem, that if you're going to do that, you end up sort of eating your tail. That said, I think from a classical liberal, I would say Scottish Enlightenment point of view, the psychological exercise of the veil of ignorance, as opposed to the philosophical thought experiment, is very valuable.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because I think that, I mean, and going back to Silicon Valley, one of the problems that these people have is that if you're a weird nerd, which is a phrase I get from this woman, Roxandra Tesla, who writes a Substack called, like mine, has a very creative name. Hers is called Roxandra's newsletter. But, if you're a weird nerd, the first thing you need to realize is that you're weird.
Right.
And there are two ways of responding to that, realizing that, most people are not like you. One is to try to mold the world to be like you. And the other is to try to make a world in which you and people like you can flourish without molding the world to be like you. And in fact, the last thing in the world you want is a world full of Elon Musks.
Sure.
I mean, you don't even want a world full of Virginia Postrels or Jonah Goldbergs. I mean, that world would, aside from everything else, be, terrible. I mean, aside from being uniform.
And I would lose my comparative advantage.
Couldn't get anything done.
Right.
So, I mean, part of when I talk to people who are out of that world, part of what I want them to realize, and a big theme in The Future and Its Enemies, as well as in Hayek's work, is the limits of knowledge.
Right.
And the limits of knowledge is not the same thing as the limits of intellect. And at the Roots of Progress conference, where I gave this little intro to dynamism, Tyler Cowen did an onstage thing where he was being interviewed, and he was asked about AI, and he made this really interesting point. I thought, he said he thinks AI is important and, really big deal, but he thinks that the people who are working in the field exaggerate how much it will transform things, because they exaggerate the importance of raw intelligence and conscientiousness, because they are highly intelligent, conscientious people.
Right.
And they need to think about other things. And so I thought that was interesting. I mean, that was in the context of just an empirical claim, not, there was nothing, he wasn't saying, and therefore you need to wise up and have more empathy for people who aren't like you, or making any kind of, normative claim. He's just saying, you're getting this wrong because you're forgetting you're weird.
Yeah. No, I'm very sympathetic to that. I mean, all right, so I don't want to talk about AI. We're over time already.
No, I don't want to talk about AI either. But is it Nozick who has the happiness machine or whatever it is? I think it is. Yeah.
Anyway, the shorthand for it is, what if there was some sort of essentially VR headset you could wear, right, or some holodeck from Star Trek,
right,
where you could be infinitely happy but not productive in any way. And I remember reading somewhere a while back this college professor who, for 20 years, had asked their students, would they agree to do the machine?
Right.
And normally no one would. And in the last 5 years or something like that, I'm butchering the anecdote, but this is the gist of it. In the last 5 years, the majority of the class says that they would do it. And it seems to me like there is, I'm not for banning video games and all that kind of stuff, but I think that one of the pernicious things about video games is the way in which they create a simulacrum, right? A version of feeling like you have made actual progress,
right?
Like you have made a contribution.
They generate the psychological state known as flow,
yeah,
which is why Megan McArdle, in her book The Upside Down, she talks about when her husband Peter Suderman got laid off, she told him he should play more video games because, when you get laid off, you tend to be bummed out. And if you get flow, you'll be less bummed out and able then to look for a job.
And so, I'm not trying to be a technocrat here, but it does seem to me that you can imagine things, like there are lots of chemical substances that give you a false state of ecstasy, right? There are things that creating machines that give you a false sense of accomplishment is not necessarily progress, to use a term that I always want to flip the safety on my rifle on. But and it seems to me that there is that's one place where I could see like let the consumers figure it all out stuff can lead you into bad cul-de-sacs. I don't know that I have a policy answer to it, but I do think it's a real possibility.
Well, earlier I mentioned Neil Stephenson's book, The Diamond Age, and one of the and how, even though it's this society with mega abundance, it's not without its problems. And one of the problems is that there is a group of people who have no affiliations and are basically what we would call an underclass, and they have their basic physical needs met by these nanotech machines that make stuff. And they can play video games all day, and he makes a very unappealing picture of that. And his argument, or whatever, it's not an argument, it's a fiction, it's a novel, but he shows other ways that other groups in society have created, have responded to that abundance. And there's always going to be people whose sort of best life probably is that kind of escapism. I think that's also a matter of understanding that there's a distribution of personality types. However, what I see today, and I talk about this a little bit at the end of my Works in Progress essay, is a yearning for what I call efficacy, which is feeling that you are good at doing something and recognizing that. And it shows up all kinds of different ways. I mean, it's like people doing MMA and weightlifting, and it's people taking up various crafts, and it's learning how to
success is another
learning how to cook. And I think the discontent that a lot of people have is from not having that feeling of efficacy. Now, that said, playing video game, I don't know. A lot of people play video games and they get satisfaction and they build communities out of it. And other people play video. I mean, I personally do not play video games except for Pokemon Go, but to which I am addicted. But I don't, because I learned back when I was writing The Future and Its Enemies, and I was playing Civilization 1, that video games are too addictive and a time sink. And so I just, never played video games after that. So, partly it's just people's personalities. I think it's very tricky talking about unearned, like, what is fake and what is real, and unearned states of mind and all that stuff. I mean, if I am, prone to depression, and I take, which I see as a completely, as far into my native state as, the flu is to my native physical state. If I take Zoloft to keep that from happening, I don't see that as a negative thing, but a lot of people do condemn that sort of thing. Yeah. I see it as no different from, the COVID vaccine, which also people condemn, or the measles vaccine, which people condemn.
We've gone long here, but I just very quickly, what did you think of Ramaswamy's actual argument that the problem is that American kids aren't taught excellence and watch too many 1990s sitcoms?
Right. I thought it was really stupid, to put it bluntly. I think, first of all, yes, I would like more excellence in America. However, I recognize excellence in many forms. And he specifically, in very stereotypical fashion, reamed out football players and beauty queens, which are both forms of excellence. I mean, you may not like those forms of excellence, but they are forms of excellence. And, and football is really super complicated. It's not just dumb guys beating each other up. I find it being a spatially challenged person, I find it very confusing. But so there are many forms of, I think, A, he needs to recognize that there are many forms of excellence. B, he needs to recognize that the kind of upbringing he's describing, which people have used the shorthand Tiger Mom, doesn't it produces people who are conscientious, but not necessarily creative. I mean, Elon Musk did not have an upbringing like that, let me tell you.
Right.
You know, Mark Andreessen did not have an upbringing like that. So if you need sort of mid-level engineers, it might, or people to work on Wall Street, it might produce those people. But I have to say, this is being one of those old waspy types, but not the New England kind, the Southern kind. I have 4 nephews and nieces who are on my side of the family, and they were not raised like that. They were raised more in the give your kids as many opportunities to pursue their interests as you can afford, but not you must do this. And 3 out of 4 of them are either studying or recently graduated from STEM programs at good schools.
Mm-hmm.
And the 4th one has worked for Google since 2015. So I think the way I was raised, the way you were, I am guessing, were raised, there are many things that are available today that I would have really loved to have when I was a kid, because I had, I could have learned languages that were not available in my high school. I could have, learned history that was, but I think, he's really getting it wrong. And there's he's also forgetting that supposedly he's talking about a tiny little percentage of the population.
Right.
And I think, and he, lots of false dichotomies. I mean, there are plenty of people who play sports or play music and also make art. Now I'm thinking of my nephews and nieces, and also do these other things. And it politically was idiotic too, because he's being, an Indian supremacist, basically, or an Asian supremacist, and and he's insulting the kind of people who are most likely to get riled by being disrespected.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a piñata. You can hit it from almost any angle and bear some fruit.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, Indians in India don't all raise their kids like that.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, so
there are a lot of cricket players and beauty queens.
Yeah. And just also, yes, exactly. And just speaking of Indian immigrants, I think the folks who run small motels in out of the way places on trucking routes are super valuable to America.
For sure.
And and I don't know how they're raising their kids, but I did a driving trip this summer between LA and ultimately Red Cloud, Nebraska, and there's a lot of Indians who made that easier.
For sure. No, also the biggest giveaway for me, because so Ramaswamy is a little bit like my gripe with Charlie Kirk, for among many, is that Kirk is an old cranky person's idea of what young people should be like.
Right.
And Ramaswamy has a little of that too. And the fact that, first of all, he's so fluent in 90s and early 2000s sitcoms while he's denouncing them is kind of interesting. But the fact is that
my parents only let me watch an hour of TV a day.
To the extent that culture matters, and I think culture matters, right? But to the extent that argument about sitcoms has any merit, it has vastly more merit at things like TikTok and Instagram and Twitter. And he can't say that's the problem, because that's
he doesn't know anything about it. That's also a possibility.
Well, but he's a big defender of the Silicon Valley guys.
Twitter is certainly a huge time sink.
Right.
And when I was writing The Fabric of Civilization, one of the things I did was, significantly reduce my, when I was, getting up toward the end, significantly reduce my social media use, which I've never gone back to the level that I was before. I will say one thing that I approve of, which is read more books.
Yes.
And I think that if you have ambitions for your children, if you can get them to read more books, it will make a lot of things easier for them, including they will not have to study vocabulary for SAT. I had this brilliant student at Chapman who got into a top economic history program, possibly the top one in the country. And I was shocked when she was talking about how she had to study the vocabulary words for the GRE. And this came up in the context of we were reading Veblen in our class. And she's like, and all those words are here. And I was like, whoa, I never had to study any of that because I spent my youth reading 19th century novels,
Yeah.
And for entertainment. So read more books. Good advice.
I agree with that. And with that, Virginia Postrel, thank you so much for doing this, and I hope to have you back.
Thank you.
Okay, 2 things. Don't close your browser on pain of death. And 2, I think I made you do this last time too. It's this really stupid gag.
Okay.
I do a close after you leave, and I blah, 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 blah. And then I say, I'll see you next time. And then the guest comes back on and just says, no, you won't. This is a podcast. It's a dumb dad joke. I can't get rid of it. So if you can just say, no, you won't. This is a podcast.
Okay.
You can do it right now.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.